So, you've got a lifelong desire to start an addiction to plastic. Well, which army is the easiest to paint for a new player? 40k is an amazing hobby, and it combines the best aspects of a lot of hobbies out there. We've got things like lore and reading. We've got amazing elements of the tabletop gameplay, which includes sort of strategy, battle plans, and army building. We've got a huge social side to the hobby of supporting each other and interacting with players face to face when you're playing. And we've got painting and creative, which for me is the best part of the hobby, but understandably I think it's the most overwhelming and intimidating for a new player. If you've never painted a miniature before, the idea of having to paint 100 just to play a game is pretty ridiculous and very scary. But today we're going to talk about and break down some of the best and worst armies for a new player to start. I'm by no means an expert when it comes to 40k, but I have been playing for over 15 years and I've owned and painted the majority of the armies out there. So I have had first-hand experience with what they're like and this sort of pros and cons that come with every army. So today we're going to break down what makes an army easy to paint and what makes it overwhelming and you're going to feel like a guardsman marching towards the front lines. I think there's three main factors. The first one is definitely got to be model count. So it sort of goes without saying, but if you've got 10 models to paint, that's an awful lot less intimidating and easier to work on than if you've got 150 to paint. So model count is hugely important. Nextly, number two, we've got model size and detail size. So sort of similar to model count, if you've got a larger miniature, the details and the areas you have to paint are going to be larger. Therefore, if you're a bit shaky in your hands or if you've got sort of poor brush control, it's a lot easier to get the paint where you want it and where you think it should be than if you're painting a small miniature where all the details are sort of blocked in and real nestled in there together. So a large miniature with fewer details, generally easier to paint. And then the third one is what painting techniques are there available for that faction. Now, you could take a Space Marine and approach it in 1,000 different ways. And so it's going to be hard to caveat all of these reasons. But generally, there are different painting methods that can go with different armies. So we're going to talk about contrast paints, airbrushing, dry brushing, these sort of things you'll hear throughout the video. And some of them are just easier techniques that if the army benefits from them, it's an easier army to paint. So with that being said, let's get right into it and start ranking these guys. I'm going to start with what I think is probably one of the best armies to paint for a new player, and that is the Orcs. A personal love of everyone who plays 40k. They're an incredibly fun faction, they have amazing lore and beautiful miniatures. And the best thing about Orcs is you can paint an Orc badly and it's exactly what the Orc wanted. It's how they wanted to be painted. So Orcs are fantastic. You can be messy, you can go out of the lines and it just looks more Orcish. Because them themselves are not perfect by any means. Everything's going to be weathered and damaged. Everything's going to be messy. When they put paint on themselves, it's not going to be in a straight line. So Orcs, I think, are a fantastic starting point into 40k. They enable the use of contrast paints, which are an amazing tool. Just to talk about contrast paints, essentially, you sort of paint in reverse. So instead of painting a miniature black and building colours up, you'll usually spray it white or cream, and then you'll use these contrast paints, which act like sort of oil washes, and they run into the recesses while also shading your highlights and your main armour panels. And they're just fantastic with Orcs. They sink into the skin really nicely. They go across, the armor panels are generally smaller, so they go across quite nicely, and they'll leave sort of highlights and lowlights, and it looks pretty perfect. And that's a great place to start if you're a new painter. Orcs offer a fantastic opportunity to get into kit bashing and to get into making your own color schemes. You can paint sort of every different unit you've got in different colors. Maybe you want your tank busters to have more red on them because they're dangerous. No. Maybe you want your bikes to have red on them because they're going faster and they're going to be quick. And then maybe you want your sort of more artillery focus to have blue on them because it's lucky. I think blue's lucky, maybe purple. Who knows? It's Orcs, it doesn't matter. Paint them however you want them. But essentially, Orcs are a great place to start as it enables just a world of freedom. Okay, so with that being said about Orcs, they're going to be our first S tier for the video. Now let's talk about Space Marines, the poster boys for Warhammer. You've seen them in Space Marine 2, you've seen animations. They're incredibly inspiring and they're what sort of bring people into the hobby. Now, Space Marines are a great starting place for a new player, as they're encouraged as a starting place for a new player. They're in pretty much every starter box it's ever been, and there's a reason for that. They are, generally speaking, larger miniatures with fewer, more pronounced details on them, very clear lines on where your colour should be. They take decently well to contrast paints, but what they give you is an amazing wealth of freedom. You can paint them however you'd like. There's 1,000 different chapters, hundreds of different colour schemes, and they are the best faction in terms of support for a new player. So what I mean by that is you're going to go on YouTube, type Space Marine painting tutorial, and there's going to be just millions of sort of great resources available to you. But generally speaking, you can't go far wrong with a Space Marine. Fewer models, large panel sizes, a lot of techniques to paint them, an incredible wealth of resources. Probably means I'm going to put them in A tier. I don't think they're quite as good as Orcs, because with Orcs you get that freedom of you can be messy, whereas a Space Marine, if you're not sort of battle damaging it, you do sort of want it to look a bit cleaner. Now, they're probably going to be a little bit harder to paint than normal Space Marines, because just breaking that down, there's 3 factions there, there's within one faction, and that means 3 different colour schemes. So 3 sets of paint you have to buy, 3 sets of paints you have to learn and get familiar. So Dark Angels, actually I might drop them down into B tier, having said that, as you just have to do a bit more with them. Blood Angels, I think, are definitely A tier. It's a striking paint scheme. Generally speaking, they're all going to be sort of red or black, so it's just 2 colours you have to learn to paint there. They have slightly more details than your classic vanilla Marines, if you will. You've got a few more teardrops and head choices and stuff like that. But generally, they're about as hard to paint as regular Space Marines, with a few more details and a few great extra characters, which are fantastic to learn and experiment with on painting. So I think they belong in A tier with the Space Marines. Now let's talk about a faction that's hard to paint. I'm going to go with Drukhari, the Dark Eldar. These guys for me, I think, are a D tier. They are an older model range, which generally means when you build a model, you have mold lines and you have joints that are sort of harder to fit together on older models. It tends to be the newer models, and the new way of Games Workshop designing miniatures are designed to be easier to put together with more seamless transitions. Whereas the old models, you're going to have mold lines, which you have to sort of scrape off. It's where just in casting, there's a bit of plastic left. And also, you have to have a lot of Dark Eldar. You're talking sort of maybe 10 to 12 vehicles across a normal sized army, and maybe 100 miniatures to go in those vehicles. Now, these miniatures are very small, they're quite detailed, and they involve a lot of edge highlighting. Edge highlighting is simply taking a brighter colour than the base colour underneath it, running it along the edges to create the illusion of sort of light hitting it, and how we never see something as one colour, but you see it as sort of a spectrum of colours when you look at an object. And the brightest is usually where the light is hitting it. Now, Dark Eldar have just hundreds of little sort of lines and panels along them that need this edge highlighting really to bring the models to life. And sadly, that is just not an easy skill to learn. It takes time and development from everyone, and I think it's a difficult place to start as a new player. Also, with that being said, the vehicles are generally smooth and very sleek, and they take very well to airbrushing, which is not a technique you're going to have available to you if you're brand new into Warhammer, because an airbrush can cost a couple $100 and it's just a big skill to learn. It's a great one to learn, but it's perhaps not for your first miniature. So therefore, I think the vehicles and the miniatures themselves are just the hardest to paint of some of the ranges. So I think they belong in D tier for me. Okay, next up, let's talk about Tyranids. They're a fantastically exciting faction for a new player to play. They're the aliens and the monsters of 40k. And I think they're great to paint. They're broken into 2 halves. You have the sort of fleshy skin colour, and then you have the chitin, which is that thick armour panel. And the fleshy skin colour takes fantastically well to contrast paints, which means you can sort of spray your model white, run a layer of contrast paint over it, and it's almost perfect. It's almost just painted in itself. Maybe you'll add a few more details. And then the chitin is pretty simple to paint. It is generally going to be 1 or 2 colours, and then you're going to run sort of micro scratches along the edges to give a really great effect. Now, that's going to be probably the hardest part of the paint job, is learning brush control and learning how to get those scratches perfect. But I don't think that's incredibly overwhelming for a new player. there are different ways you can either avoid it, or you can just sort of practice edge highlighting to start with and then build up to those little scratches. So I think Tyranids serve as a sort of perfect place for a new player to begin, get great models painted very quickly just with contrast paints, and then really work on your sort of brush control and details as you go through the army. So I think they're a fantastic place to start, and I'm actually going to put them above the Blood Angels in A tier, as I think they are just very exciting for a new person. The only issue with them is you can have a very high model count if you're not going too monster heavy. However, I feel these days most lists are going to be sort of 50% monsters, 50% miniatures. So on your 50% like little things, sorry, so gaunts and like gargoyles and things like that. So they are perhaps overwhelming to paint as there's a high model count there. But the monsters and stuff, if you focus more on them, it's a lot lower model count and a lot of very exciting miniatures to paint, as they're all the big exciting. Let's talk about a Chaos faction. Now, if you start Chaos, or if anyone plays Chaos, you're gonna hear the phrase Chaos trim. It sort of goes without saying, it's a very unpleasant thing to paint. It is the gold or silver that runs around every model, and it sort of goes on every armor panel, it's on every hand, every helmet, and it means that once you've painted your base color, let's say it's black for Black Legion, or red for World Eaters and Khorne, it means then you have to be very careful as you go around and you paint all this trimming with a metallic color. Now, if you go over the lines, it's really hard to correct. Metallics generally are very thick and high in pigment, so they really sit on, if you overspill with a metallic, you can really tell, as it's really clear where you sort of put it. It's a very vibrant paint. So Chaos is a hard army to paint, as you have to have great brush control and you have to be able to paint this trim over and over and over again. And it becomes very repetitive and difficult when you get to sort of your 100th Space Marine. So Chaos, I think, are an overwhelming faction to paint. They have a lot of new, exciting models, but they're very detailed. They involve just a lot of different color paints, which you might not have available to you as a new player, where you sort of need, you need a pink to paint a tongue, but then you're never going to use a pink again on the armor. So you sort of feel like, do I have to buy this paint for this? So I think Chaos belong in the C tier, really, or Black Legion do anyway. Now, a Chaos faction that is a lot easier to paint are the Death Guard. These guys are the messy, dirty Nurgle Space Marines, and they are a lot more fun to paint. They have a lot less trim on them. They hardly have any, really. And they encourage dirty, weathered painting styles, which means you can use a shade, such as Agrak's Earth Shade, to just cover the miniature. It's going to make it look dirty, and it's going to fill in all the recesses and little bits where you've missed, and it'll make the model look amazing in a very simple way. Now, I actually think Death Guard are one of the most fun armies to paint. You get to paint these cool, gruesome details. They have mutations coming out of them. So it's very inspiring and exciting as a new person painting. You can experiment with sort of green stuffing your own mutations and painting things fabulous colors. That being said, a bit like regular Chaos, is you're going to need quite a range of paints, which is just a monetary cost, and it's a bit of a ball ache. But I think Death Guard are some of the most fun models to paint, and they belong in the A tier for me. Talking about just a regular Space Marine chapter again, Black Templars have all the same pros and cons as Space Marines. However, you're painting a black armor, which is hard to get to look right. As black, you usually want to edge highlight it very cleanly. And edge highlighting, as we talked about with Drakari, is just a bit difficult for a new person. You need great brush control. So they're quite intimidating, and then they have white details on top of black armor. Now, it's very hard to paint white over a dark color, which sort of means it's a very counterintuitive paint scheme. So you have to build up that white with a lot of different colors of paint, and if you just put one layer of white over black, it's going to look really bad, really rough, and it can be quite a setback to painting, is when you've got a great looking black and you put your white on it and it just doesn't look nice. So you have to learn how to comfortably build up to white, which I think is difficult. So for me, the Black Templars I think could actually go down in C tier. They're definitely harder to paint than Dark Angels, but they're going to be a bit easier to paint than Chaos Marines. The same can be said for Deathwatch, where you've got a black colour scheme, but this time with silver and sort of red accents and the different chapter accents on the shoulder pads. The black is hard to paint on Deathwatch, but the silver and stuff is a lot easier to paint than the white details on Black Templar. So that's why they're also going to go in this C tier. Now, talking about another great army for beginners, I want to talk about Necrons. Now, these guys are a bit of a meme, a bit of a joke, that you just take a silver spray paint, you spray all your models, you cover them in a wash of Nuln Oil, and they're done. I mean, that is a fantastic way of painting Necrons, and it does look amazing. However, I think there's definitely a lot more to the range than there used to be 5 or 10 years ago. We now have models such as the Void Dragon and the Silent King and the new Nightbringer, which are all these big beasts, and they are difficult to paint. You're going to have to work on blending and transitions and getting sort of smooth finishes on these big areas of cloaks and capes, as well as painting the silver really well and these sort of glowing details. So I think Necrons are still a fantastic army for new players to paint. They take very well to the contrast paints over the silver. You can learn how to dry brush, which is a fantastic skill to learn, very new in your sort of painting repertoire. So Necrons have to be S tier for me. However, I think that goes with a caveat of saying they are not as easy to paint as they used to be. The Warriors and the Scarabs are still easy. You can do a nice dry brush of silver, a wash or a contrast paint over the top of that, and then another dry brush with a brighter silver, and you're going to have an amazing looking miniature. However, these big models that you're going to want a Void Dragon, because look at it, are a lot more overwhelming and difficult to paint, I think, and I think that's worth acknowledging. Now, a difficult army to paint for me, and one of the ones I am least excited to paint when I have to, is Sisters of Battle, Adeptus Sororitas. Generally speaking, you've got tiny miniatures, some of the smallest in the 40k range, covered in details, and then even the stuff that should be easier to paint, like their tanks, are absolutely swarming in details. You've got that black armor again, which, as I said, is a difficult color to paint, covered in gold trim, white details, candles burning on it, scrolls everywhere. There's an awful lot of detail there. It's very hard to learn to paint as a new player. You've got quite a big model count, lots of small detailed miniatures, and they're detailed with hard details. So I'd say, like, to get a sister's hair right, that colour sort of white that still looks realistic but it's not just bone white, is difficult to do. It's difficult to also get the scrolls looking nice. Usually you want to do a little bit of freehand of words, and I mean, it's so incredibly small, it's really hard to learn as a new player. So Sisters, I think, are one of the worst armies you could start with. Absolutely one of the hardest armies to paint for me, and I'm not excited for them personally. Now, talking about more chaos, my eye is being drawn here to the Khorne Berserkers. So we've got a red and a gold colour scheme. Two fun colours to paint. I think red is easier to paint than black, absolutely, but you still have loads of this chaos trim that you have to get through. So just the chaos trim alone, I think they have to go in C tier, but they are by far the highest of C tier for me, as you get to paint a really nice red, you get vibrant colours, you can be messy with the models, they are usually covered in blood and gore, so you can afford battle damage, you can learn how to put paint chips on them, you can learn how to do blood splatters. These are great techniques for you sort of developing your painting as you go through the army. Now, Grey Knights are interesting as they are a silver space marine, so much like the Necrons, they get sort of memed on a bit for being, you can sort of just spray them silver and call them done. However, I think there's a lot more to them than that. You want to play with the silver and get blues into that silver using sort of washes or different painting techniques, and that's difficult. They then have a lot of details on them. There's lots of bangly bits. There's runes sort of etched into the armor, so you have to get in there. Now, a personal technique I like is there's a new contrast paint out. I can't remember the name of it, but it's essentially a bright yellow contrast paint that when you have the silver underneath it, you can put the contrast paint in those details and it fills them in really nicely and it makes them look gold. So I think contrast paints have enabled this army to be easier to paint. However, you're still looking at some difficult colours. You've got whites in there, that need to go over this silver. You've got some large, more intimidating models in the Dread Knights. So they're certainly, I think, one of the easiest Space Marines to paint, but they're definitely not an S tier for me. I'm going to put them in the high A tiers, as I think a Grey Knights army is easier to paint than a standard sort of Ultramarines army. Astra Militarum, Imperial Guard, are a perfect B tier for me. You have awesome infantry, but you have a lot of it. So you're going to be looking to try and paint these guys quickly. You're going to want to do them in as few steps as possible. So contrast paints are fantastic for this, but there's also, they've been around for as long as the game has. There's some amazing recipes of how to paint Guard really well in any different color scheme really quickly. However, you're learning some great skills while you're doing it. You're learning how to batch paint. You're learning how to apply your time in a useful way. So getting the most out of what time you have to paint, and you sort of learn where you want to put attention into a model. But Guard have a fantastic amount of tanks, which is a lot easier to paint, I think, for a new person. The tanks are also not one color. They are these sort of two-tone camo colors, which I think actually makes them easier to paint than it does, let's say you have just a blue Rhino for the Space Marines, where you've just got one big flat color. Actually having the two color camo makes it an awful lot easier to paint, as you don't have to worry about getting a nice clean finish on this huge expanse of armor. So Guard for me, I think, belong in the B tier. They can be really hard to paint when you're just doing thousands of infantry, and they can also be very easy to paint if you've got if you're doing Ogrins and tanks. It's a nice model range, I think. Votan for me are going to be a C tier army. These are new models, and so they come with nice sort of easy to build kits. I reckon pop them here, just above the Death Watch. So they're nice, easy to build kits. However, they are tiny. They are space dwarves. So the details on them are very small. There's not a huge amount of resources yet into how to paint them well. And they come with quite detailed models for the size of them. And you need quite a lot of them, as well as the kits are expensive, which is obviously overwhelming for a new player. It's hard to find sort of second-hand armies of Votan. So Votan are a harder army to paint, definitely not impossible, and a great place to start if you're looking to sort of really try and work on your painting, as that's going to be the main reason you're doing the hobby, is you want to learn how to edge highlight and you want to learn how to paint details that are smaller. They're not terrible to start there. Now let's talk about one of my favourite armies, which is the Space Wolves. They are a harder to paint Space Marine. So they still have the large armor panels and things of the Space Marines we talked about earlier. However, they come with a lot more detail and texture. You've got fur covering the models. You've got a sort of shoulder pads where you might want to do two colors. You want a sort of a yellow and a red, and that's difficult to learn. You have to learn freehanding. They're covered in runes and different symbols where you have to sort of pick out these small details. You need good knowledge of light and exaggeration to make the details stand out and look convincing. So Space Wolves, I think, are an amazing Space Marine faction, but they are, I think, the hardest to paint. So for that reason, I'm going to put them above the Imperial Guard here in B tier. Talking about Chaos Demons, these guys are super exciting models. They are bright, fun, vibrant. They offer a lot of creativity. I think due to the model count you need if you're going to play a Chaos Demon army is very overwhelming. You're going to need hundreds of miniatures, and the miniatures are quite old. Generally speaking, old miniatures are a little bit harder to build. They're going to need a little bit more love in terms of mold line removing and gap filling, and they don't take as well to contrast paints as newer miniatures, as the newer miniatures seem to be designed with more of an eye for beginner painting and having easier sort of spaces for contrast to flow into, whereas some of the demons are just a little bit lacking in detail on their sort of large bodies, so the contrast paint doesn't really have anything to cling to, which it likes to. So I think demons are super exciting and a great army to start with, but they do definitely have their drawbacks. So I'm probably going to put them above the Guard here in B tier. Eldari. I think they're a very difficult place for a new player to start with. if you look through their range, you've got the Wraith Knights and the tanks, which are these large models that, as I said before, they take with the Drukhari, they take very well to airbrushing, and they do just look a lot better when you airbrush them. And that's not a technique we're going to have available to us if we're a new person. Then, if you look at the miniatures, you've got very small, spindly miniatures that, once again, you want to do things like edge highlighting. You've got small details to paint on there in terms of the helmets and the runes. All of their models are sort of different colours. So you've got striking scorpions, which you're going to want green. You've got howling banshees, which you're going to want this cream colour. You've got fire dragons, which you're going to want red. So you sort of need to develop a big collection of paints to be able to just paint these different miniatures that you've got in your range, as well as you're going to want to learn sort of techniques for how to approach all of them. So your Dark Reapers that are black, you're going to want to take more of sort of an edge highlighting approach, whereas your striking scorpions, you need to develop vibrancy in your paints, and you want to be using yellows and the greens to make your miniatures really pop. So I think there's a lot to learn to paint a nice Eldari army, and I think it's a pretty intimidating place to start. Why not? D tier for me. Now, Tau are a very interesting faction in terms of they're a very bad faction, and you shouldn't play Tau because no one's going to like you. But if you can get over that, they are quite fun to paint. They edge highlight probably the easiest of any army. The lines on them are very clear of where to sort of run your brush and do the edge highlighting. And a bit like Space Marines is they have a lot of paint schemes that are very fun. I would recommend not going with the sort of brown colour box art that the GW guys tend to go with. They've moved into white now, but I would recommend going with a sort of a blue or a red colour scheme. It's just an easier colour to paint. And then generally speaking, the Tau take very well to paint. As I said, the crisis suits and the battle suits and the broadsides and the riptides and the small miniatures themselves edge highlight nicely. They take paint very well. You can use contrast paints on the fabrics very easily. The tanks are a little harder to paint, but generally speaking, I think they are just a nice B-tier army. One of the hardest armies to paint is Genestealer cults. Much like Sisters of Battle, these guys are just tiny. You need a huge model count to play a Genestealer cult army. And the details on these tiny models are tiny themselves and very numerous. They are covered in pouches and pistols and guns and bags and sachets and stuff. So there's just a lot of detail on these tiny models that you need a lot of. And that is the sort of triple header of intimidating and a tough time to start with as a new player. So Genestealer cults belong in the D tier for me, but I'd still rather paint them than Sisters of Battle. Thousand Suns take everything I said about Chaos Marines and make it worse. They have a lot more detail on them than sort of a regular Chaos Space Marine, and you need to paint in a sort of ethereal way to make the blues really pop. So they're very similar to paint to just a normal Chaos Space Marine, but a little bit harder. Now, Custodes. Custodes are the best army for me if you're going to start as a new player. They have a low model count, so you can field an army with 30 miniatures, which is a very approachable amount to paint. The models are super big themselves. They are larger than a Space Marine, just about, and they have fewer details on them than a lot of other factions. Generally speaking, you can paint most of the model entirely gold and then go in with sort of a red or a purple for the cloth colours, which means you can do them super quickly and you can sort of be as anal as you want about the details you want to paint. So if you want to just paint the whole miniature gold, it's going to look great. If you want to go a bit further and you want to pick out some of the like the thing on the chest, the detail on the chest and the shoulder pads, you can. So they're a good army to also learn how to spend more time painting if you want to be more pedantic. So like any faction on this list, they can be as hard or as easy as you want to paint, but if you want them to be easy to paint, they are very easy to paint. You sort of look at a gold, a wash and a highlight and they're done. And I think the low model count means they have to go above Necrons and they have to go above Orcs for me. So Custodes are going to be our S tier and definitely our best army to start with as a new person painting. Now, I didn't really mean to do this, but probably the hardest army, I think, are Admech. These are small miniatures, once again. They are very spindly miniatures, so they have lots of things coming off them that can snap off very easily. They have a lot of detail on them, and the details are real packed in close on an Admech model. So you've got metal in with cloth, in with an Admech symbol that needs to be sort of white and black. So they're very intimidating to paint as a new person. They have a very high model count as a faction, if you're playing Skitarii especially. So you need to paint a lot of them, which isn't great. And then the tanks and the larger mechs, you really want to be airbrushing them. They have some difficult things to paint on there. You want good flesh colors, you want good sort of smooth armor. So Admech, sadly, because they look very cool, are one of the hardest factions to paint, I think, just due to the sheer amount of models you need, how small these models are, and then they're incredibly detailed and intricate and real packed in close. So I think that concludes our list for me today. I mean, it's very controversial. These are just my opinions, but I think generally speaking, these are some of the best places to start. So to conclude this, to wrap up, Custodes, absolutely my favorite army for a new person to start with. You can paint them very simply, you got a low model count, and you can really learn how to sort of control your paintbrush, and it's a very welcoming experience. Then next you have the Necrons. These are great for painting in batch. You can learn dry brushing, you can learn how to apply contrast paints properly. Fantastic army to start with. And then finally, Orcs are just a lot of fun. They are probably the hardest of the S tier army to paint because you need a lot of them, and yeah, they're going to be a bit more intimidating, they're a bit more detailed, but you get that great excuse of it's Orky, and if I paint out the lines, I'm meant to, and that's fantastic. And then armies to avoid, especially, I think the Eldar and the Dark Eldar are too small, too complicated, too much in need of edge highlighting and things like that. The Admech, just stay away with if it's your first army and you're scared by painting. They're sadly just not the place to start. All those metallics in that sort of small miniature, it's very difficult to get right. And then Genestealer Cults and Sisters of Battle are, once again, small miniatures that are incredibly detailed, and it's just a bit of a slog, and it can be a bit disheartening when they don't look how you want them to, sort of straight away, and they're so detailed that you really need to spend some time sort of developing your painting skills, sadly, to get these armies right, I think. And then as for that, everything in the middle is sort of what it is. If you want to paint Chaos Trim, go with Chaos, but you are going to regret it. And then if you want to paint Space Marines and stuff, I would recommend picking a slightly easier color scheme. So you want to stay away from whites, yellows, and blacks, because they're traditionally the hardest colors to paint. You want colors more in the middle there. You want your greens, your blues, your reds. Sort of your primary colors, if you ignore yellow, are sort of the best place to go with, really. In Space Marines and in sort of Tau and Tyranids and these sort of armies, try and go with your classics, your greens, your blues, your reds, and you can't go far wrong. But ultimately speaking, paint whatever you want to paint. Welcome to the hobby. I hope you enjoy it and you stick around. It's a fantastic hobby to get into. Genuinely, I've done it for over 15 years now, and I love the hobby. And I think it's fantastic, and enjoy the creativity it gives you. Enjoy the pain you have when you're having to paint 100 models. It's worth it when you get to the end and you can field a beautiful army that is yours and you're proud of it. So yeah, thank you very much for watching this video. Ultimately, paint whatever you'd like to paint. It is a creative hobby, and these miniatures are yours and yours alone. And the pride you'll feel fielding your own army that has your own ideas in it, your own creativity, and your own blood, sweat, and tears is a fantastic feeling. And it's one that's well worth aiming towards. And please don't be put off painting. I hope this helps as a guide, if you are scared of painting, of where to maybe start and where to avoid. But ultimately, you're a free-willed human. Do whatever the F you want and enjoy it. So thank you very much for checking in. I'll see you next time. Bye.